Some wounds never heal, no matter how many years you spend running from them. At 68, mountain trapper Whitaker has learned that the past has a way of finding you, even in the most forgotten corners of the world. When a winter storm forces him to take shelter in the abandoned mining town of Copper Falls, he meets a young woman who shouldn't exist. She's about 25, wild as the mountain itself, and wearing a silver locket that belongs to someone who died 40 years ago. The woman he loved and lost. This stranger speaks his name like she's known him forever, and claims she knows where the old rail tunnel leads. The same tunnel that swallowed half the town and every soul brave enough to enter. But how can she know secrets that were buried before she was born? What's really waiting in the heart of that mountain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of Copper Falls, like the dying breath of a ghost town. Whitaker pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped through what had once been Main Street, his boots crunching on snow that hadn't been disturbed by human footsteps in decades. The storm had caught him 3 miles from his usual shelter, and pride be damned. At 68, a man learned to choose survival over stubbornness. He'd avoided this place for 40 years. 40 long years of trapping these mountains, following the same routes, reading the same signs in the sky and snow, but never coming here. Until tonight, the buildings stood like broken teeth against the grey sky, their roofs caved in under the weight of countless winters. Windows gaped empty, their glass long since claimed by wind and time. But the bones of the place remained strong, built from Montana, pine, and the stubborn hope of men who believed they could scratch fortune from stone. Whitaker's weathered hands pulled a small leather journal from his coat pocket, 40 years of observations, sketches of animal tracks, weather patterns, encoded entries about things he'd never spoken aloud. The journal had been his only companion through 4 decades of solitude, more faithful than any dog, more honest than any friend. Its pages held the wisdom of a man who'd learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture. He tucked it away and chose the most intact building, what might have been a boarding house once. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, but the interior offered shelter from the wind. As he cleared debris to make space for his bedroll, memories tried to surface like miners' ghosts. He pushed them down, focused on the practical matters of survival. Build a small fire. Melt snow for water. Check his snares in the morning when the storm passed. The mining disaster had happened in 1883. Whitaker remembered the date because it had changed everything, not just for Copper Falls. But for him, 37 men had gone into the mountain that morning. Only 12 had come out, and those 12 had never spoken of what they'd seen in the darkness before the tunnel collapsed. The official report blamed faulty timber supports and methane gas. The survivors knew better, but fear had sealed their lips more effectively than any oath. Within a year, the town had emptied. Families packed their belongings and left for places where the ground didn't shake with unnatural tremors, where children didn't wake screaming from dreams of something vast and hungry moving beneath their beds. By 1885, Copper Falls existed only in memory and on maps that were already growing yellow with age. Whitaker had been here then, not as the grizzled hermit he'd become, but as a young man with calloused hands and a head full of dreams. A geological surveyor, mapping these peaks for the territorial government, documenting mineral deposits, and planning routes for railways that would bring civilization to the wilderness. He'd been good at his job, perhaps too good. The maps he'd drawn had guided the miners straight to their doom, and Elena had been with him. The name still hit him like a physical blow, even after all these years. Elena Redhawk, daughter of a Blackfoot woman and an Irish prospector, caught between 2 worlds but belonging fully to both. She'd been his assistant, his partner, and in secret, because such things mattered more in those days, his wife. Married by a circuit preacher in a ceremony witnessed only by mountains and sky. their union blessed by both her grandmother's ancient words and his mother's Bible. Elena had understood the mountain in ways his instruments never could. She'd walk the ridgelines at dawn, feeling for vibrations in the stone, listening to sounds that existed below the range of human hearing. When she spoke of the mountain's moods, other prospectors had dismissed her as a superstitious half-breed. Whitaker had known better. Elena's instincts had saved their lives more than once. She'd died in the collapse. Or so everyone believed. Whitaker built his fire with practiced efficiency, using dry wood he'd found in what had been the building's kitchen. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, bringing momentary life to the abandoned space. He opened a can of beans, ate mechanically while the storm raged outside. 40 years of meals eaten alone had taught him that food was fuel, nothing more. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of memory pressed down like the mountain itself. He couldn't shake the feeling that coming here had broken some invisible barrier he'd spent decades building. The journal in his pocket seemed heavier, its coded entries about that final summer suddenly urgent, demanding to be remembered. He'd left Montana Territory 3 days after Elena's funeral, such as it was, with no body to bury and only a grave marker carved from local stone. He'd walked away from his surveying career, from his maps and instruments, from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. The mountain had taken Elena, and he'd sworn never to give it another chance to take anything from him. For 40 years, he'd kept that promise. He'd become a different man, solitary, careful, asking nothing from the world except to be left alone. He'd learned to trap and hunt, to read weather in the color of morning clouds, to find shelter in places where other men would die of exposure. The mountain had shaped him into something harder than the stone itself, and he'd thought that would be enough. A sound from outside made him freeze. Not the wind. He knew every voice the wind could use in these peaks. This was different. Deliberate, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow, moving with purpose despite the storm. Whitaker reached for the rifle that never left his side, a well-maintained Winchester that had fed him for decades. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boarded opening. The snow fell so thick he could barely see 10 feet, but there, a shape moving between the buildings. Too tall to be an animal, too sure-footed to be lost. The footsteps stopped outside his shelter. "Mr. Whitaker?" The voice was young, female, barely audible above the wind. "I know you're in there. I've been waiting for you to come back." His blood turned to ice. No one knew his name. No one knew he existed, much less that he might come to this cursed place. He'd been careful for 40 years, trading for supplies in towns where no one asked questions, leaving no trail that could lead back to Thomas Whitaker, the surveyor who disappeared after the Copper Falls disaster. "Please," the voice continued, "I need to show you something. It's about Elena." The rifle trembled in his hands. Elena's name, spoken by a stranger, cut deeper than any blade. He moved to the door, lifted the bar he'd placed across it, and stepped into the storm. She stood 20 feet away, seemingly unbothered by the wind that made him squint against the stinging snow. Young, as he'd guessed, maybe 25, with long dark hair that whipped around her face. She wore clothes suited for the mountains, heavy coat, wool pants, boots that had seen hard use. But it was what hung around her neck that made his breath catch, a silver locket, heart-shaped, with delicate engravings that caught what little light filtered through the storm. He'd seen it only once before, clasped around Elena's throat on their wedding day. She told him it belonged to her grandmother, that it carried protection from the old spirits. "You're not real," he said, his voice hoarse from years of speaking only to himself. "This is a dream, or madness. God knows I've expected both for long enough." The young woman smiled, and for a moment, just a moment, her face held something familiar. Not Elena's features exactly, but the same quiet strength, the same deep knowledge that came from listening to things other people couldn't hear. "My name is Mira," she said, stepping closer, "and I've been looking for you for a very long time. We need to talk about the tunnel, Mr. Whitaker. We need to talk about what's been waiting in the mountain all these years." Thunder rolled across the peaks. Impossible thunder in a snowstorm. The sound coming from deep underground rather than the sky above. The abandoned buildings of Copper Falls seemed to shiver in response, and somewhere in the distance, something vast and ancient stirred in its sleep. Whitaker looked at the locket, at Mira's face, at the town that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. The past had finally caught up with him, just as he'd always known it would. The only question now was whether he was brave enough or foolish enough to face what came next. Mira followed him back into the shelter without invitation, shaking snow from her coat with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged. Whitaker watched her move around his small fire, noting how she stepped over debris without looking, how she seemed to know exactly where the floor was solid and where it might give way. This wasn't her first time in these ruins. "You've been here before," he said, settling back onto his bedroll but keeping the rifle within reach. "Many times." She sat cross-legged on the floor, the firelight playing across her weathered features. Up close, he could see she was older than his first impression. Not 25, but a woman who'd lived hard years in wild places. "I've been camping in these mountains for 6 months, waiting for you to come back. Grandmother said you would, eventually. She said the mountain wouldn't let you stay away forever. Your grandmother's dead, child. Has been for 40 years or more." Mira reached into her pack, a well-made thing of leather and canvas, and withdrew something that made Whitaker's heart stop. A folded piece of oiled cloth, yellowed with age, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but now showed only the faintest trace of color. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing sheets of paper covered in familiar handwriting. "Elena kept a map," Mira said, spreading the papers between them. "Not the kind you made for the territorial government? This one shows the real tunnels, the ones that were already here when the miners started digging." Whitaker leaned forward despite himself. The map was drawn in Elena's careful hand, each line precise and confident. But the tunnels it showed made no sense. Passages that curved back on themselves, chambers that couldn't exist according to the geological surveys he'd conducted. At the bottom of the main sheet, Elena had written notes in the old language her grandmother had taught her, symbols that meant nothing to him but somehow felt heavy with warning. "This is impossible," he whispered. "I mapped every inch of that mountain. These passages, they weren't there." "You mapped what you could see," Mira corrected. Elena mapped what was really there, the places where the old ones used to walk before the mountain learned to hide them. She traced one tunnel with her finger, a passage that seemed to spiral deep into the earth. She knew something was wrong. That's why she tried to stop the mining. The words hit him like a physical blow. Elena never tried to stop anything. She supported the project. We both did. We needed the work, the money. She tried to tell you. Mira's voice was gentle but implacable. The last 3 weeks before the collapse, she begged you to shut down the operation. Said the mountain was warning everyone to stay away. You thought she was being superstitious. Whitaker's mind reeled, 40-year-old memories shifting like loose stones on a steep slope. Had Eleanor tried to warn him? In those final weeks, she'd been strange, distant. She'd spent hours staring at the tunnel mouth, listening to sounds he couldn't hear. He'd attributed it to nerves, to the natural fear any reasonable person would feel about working in such dangerous conditions. "You're lying," he said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mira unfolded another sheet, not a map this time, but a letter. The paper was brittle with age, but the ink remained clear. Elena's handwriting, as familiar to him as his own breath. "Read it," she said simply. With trembling hands, Whitaker took the letter. The date at the top made him dizzy. September 15th, 1883, 1 week before the collapse. "My dearest Thomas," it began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and someone who cares about the truth has found these papers. I pray it will be you, but I fear you may never understand what I'm about to tell you. The mountain is not empty. It never was. What the miners have found isn't just rock and ore, it's a prison. Something ancient lives in the deep places. something that was old when my grandmother's people first came to these peaks. The elders knew to leave it alone. They built their sacred places to keep it sleeping, to maintain the balance, but the mining has broken that balance. Every day we go deeper. Every tunnel we carve weakens the barriers that were put in place long ago. I can feel it stirring, Thomas. In my dreams, I hear it calling. It knows we're here, and it's learning our scent. I've tried to tell you, but you think I'm letting fear cloud my judgment. You trust your instruments more than my grandmother's wisdom. I don't blame you. You were raised in a world that believes only in what can be measured and mapped. But some things exist beyond the reach of your surveying tools. If something happens to me, please don't let them blame faulty supports or bad luck. What comes next will be my choice, my responsibility. Someone has to make sure the old barriers hold. Someone has to keep the sleeper in its bed. I love you more than words can say, but love alone won't save us from what's coming. Remember me not as the woman who died in darkness, but as the one who chose to stand between the light and what would devour it. Forever yours, Elena. The letter fell from Whitaker's nerveless fingers. 40 years of carefully constructed beliefs crumbled like poorly mortared stone. Elena hadn't died in an accident. She'd chosen to die, chosen to seal herself in the mountain with whatever ancient thing the miners had disturbed. She caused the collapse, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She saved the world, Mira replied. My grandmother was one of the survivors. She saw Elena go into the deepest tunnel alone, saw her trigger the charges that brought the mountain down. Grandmother spent the rest of her life watching, making sure the seal held. When she got too old to climb these peaks, she passed the responsibility to my mother. When Mother died, it came to me. And now you're here because the seal is weakening. Mira's eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. 40 years of Elena's sacrifice, holding back something that wants nothing more than to break free and finish what it started. But she's tired, Mr. Whitaker. The barriers are failing, as if summoned by her words. A sound rose from somewhere far below, not the settling of old timber or the shifting of loose stone, but something organic and hungry. A sound like breathing, if lungs could be the size of houses. The fire flickered, though no wind touched it, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees in as many seconds. What does it want? Whitaker asked, though part of him already knew the answer. What it's always wanted, Mira said, gathering Elena's papers back into their oiled cloth. To be free, to reshape the world according to its own appetites, to turn every living thing into an extension of its will. She looked up at him, and he saw Elena's determination burning in her dark eyes. Elena can't hold it much longer. That's why I came looking for you. I'm an old man. Whatever you think I can do, you're the only one who can take her place. Mira stood, shouldering her pack. Elena's blood runs in my veins, but her heart belongs to you. The binding requires both, her sacrifice and the love that made it meaningful. Outside, the storm was weakening, but the sounds from below grew stronger. Somewhere in the depths of the mountain, something vast was stirring to wakefulness. After 40 years of patient waiting, it sensed opportunity in the failing barriers, in the approach of those who carried the keys to its freedom. Whitaker looked at the rifle in his hands, at the dying fire, at the young woman who'd brought his past back to claim him. He thought of Elena, alone in the darkness for 4 decades, holding back horrors that would drive lesser souls to madness. He thought of the world above, unaware of how close it had come to ending, again and again, through one woman's endless sacrifice. The tunnel mouth, he said finally. Where is it? Mira smiled, and this time the resemblance to Elena was unmistakable. Half a mile north of here. But we'll need to go deep, Mr. Whitaker. Deeper than any miner ever dared. Are you ready to face what's been waiting for you all these years? He wasn't. He knew he wasn't. But he also knew that some debts could only be paid with everything a man had left to give. Lead the way, he said. The tunnel mouth yawned before them like the maw of some primordial beast, its edges crusted with ice that glowed blue in the pale morning light. Whitaker had expected the entrance to be completely sealed after 40 years, but someone, or something, had kept it partially clear. Broken timbers and chunks of stone formed a barrier, but gaps remained large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. "The mountain wants us to enter," Mira said, adjusting the coils of rope slung across her shoulder. "It's been calling to those it needs, drawing them back." Whitaker tested the stability of the debris pile with his boot. The stones shifted slightly but held his weight. His surveyor's eye automatically catalogued the structure: limestone and granite mixed with rotted pine. Probably stable enough for careful passage, but treacherous for anyone in a hurry. "You've been through here before," he observed. 3 times. Each time I go a little deeper." She pulled a canvas bundle from her pack, unwrapping it to reveal oil-soaked torches and a brass lantern that had seen better days. "The first time, I only made it 50 yards before the voices started. The second time, I found the old mining camp. The third—" She paused, touching Elena's locket at her throat. "The third time, I found these." From the bottom of the bundle, she withdrew a collection of letters tied with the same faded blue ribbon. But these were different from Elena's map and final warning. The paper was newer, the ink less faded, though still decades old. "More letters?" Whitaker asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "Written after she died," Mira said quietly. "Or after everyone thought she died." "Elena's been down there for 40 years, Mr. Whitaker. Alive in ways that don't make sense to people like us, but alive nonetheless. She's been writing to you." The world tilted around him. Whitaker reached for the pile of debris to steady himself, his mind struggling to process what Mira was suggesting. Elena alive in the darkness, writing letters to a man who'd spent 4 decades believing her dead. "That's impossible." "Read them," Mira said, pressing the bundle into his hands. "Then tell me what's impossible." With trembling fingers, he untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated December 25th, 1883, 2 months after the collapse. Elena's handwriting, unmistakable despite the strange circumstances. "My beloved Thomas," it began. "Today marks my 2nd month in the deep places, and I find myself thinking of Christmas mornings we shared. Do you remember the snow globe you bought me in Denver? How we watched the tiny flakes swirl around the miniature village, creating a perfect world contained in glass. I think of that often now, surrounded as I am by a different kind of contained world. The Ancient One sleeps fitfully, but it sleeps. The barriers hold, though maintaining them requires constant vigilance. I cannot explain how I survive here. The rules that govern life in the upper world seem mutable in these depths. Perhaps it's the mountain's own power that sustains me, or perhaps love itself becomes something more substantial in a place where hope should die. I dream of you often. In my dreams, you haven't aged at all. You're still the young surveyor who traced my face with his fingertips and promised we'd map the world together. I hope you've forgiven yourself for what you think was your failure to save me. The choice was mine, Thomas. It was always mine. I pray you're safe. I pray you found peace away from this cursed place. But if you're reading this, it means the barriers are failing, and you've come back to help me. I knew you would. Even sleeping, the Ancient One speaks of you, recognizes the love that made my sacrifice possible. Until we meet again, Eleanor. The letter slipped from his hands as tears he hadn't shed in 40 years burned his eyes. He picked up another, dated 5 years later, then another from a decade past that. Each one spoke of Elena's vigil in the darkness, of the creature she held at bay, of her undying love for the man she'd left behind. The most recent letter was dated only 6 months ago. "Thomas, my eternal love," it read. "I feel you drawing closer to this place. The mountain stirs with anticipation of your return. After all these years, the time has come for us to stand together against the darkness. The Ancient One grows stronger each day, feeding on the fear and anger that seeps down from the world above. I cannot hold it much longer alone. Our great niece will guide you to me. Trust her, as you once trusted me. She carries our bloodline and our purpose, the ritual that will transfer my burden to willing hands, requires three elements: the blood of the mountain's daughter, the love of her chosen heart, and the sacrifice of one who chooses duty over desire. Do not mourn what must be. 40 years I've spent in these depths, and they have been filled with purpose. To save the world by keeping one ancient evil contained, what greater legacy could any soul ask for? Come to me, my beloved. Come and let us finish what we began so long ago. Forever yours, Elena. She knew, Whitaker whispered. She knew you'd find me. Grandmother told me where to look, Mira said, shouldering her pack. Elena appears to her sometimes in dreams, and tells her what needs to be done. She gestured toward the tunnel entrance. We need to go, Mr. Whitaker. The Ancient One is stirring. Every minute we delay gives it more time to test the barriers. As if summoned by her words, a tremor ran through the mountain. Not an earthquake. Whitaker had felt enough of those to know the difference. This was more purposeful, like the movement of something vast, shifting position deep underground. Pebbles rained from the tunnel mouth, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, metal rang against stone with deliberate rhythm. What kind of creature are we talking about? He asked, following Mira through the gap in the debris. Grandmother's people had many names for it, she replied, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The hungry dark, the sleeper beneath. The one who dreams of ending. European miners would have called it a demon, maybe, or some forgotten god. Truth is, it's older than human language. It was here before the mountains rose, sleeping in the deep places, waiting for something to wake it. The tunnel beyond the entrance was a mixture of natural cave and human engineering. Rotted support timbers marked where miners had widened natural passages, while rusted rail tracks disappeared into the darkness ahead. Ice covered everything in crystalline sheets that reflected their lamplight in strange, disturbing patterns. The cold helps, Mira explained, noticing his shivering. Elena learned to use it early on. The Ancient One draws strength from warmth, from life itself. The deeper we go, the colder it gets. That's how we know she's still fighting. They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps echoing in the frozen tunnel. Whitaker found himself automatically cataloguing the structure, noting where cave-ins had been cleared, where ice formations suggested water sources. Old habits died hard, even in circumstances that defied everything his rational mind wanted to believe. There, Mira said, pointing ahead to where their lamplight caught something that wasn't stone or ice. A wooden crate sat beside the tunnel wall, its contents protected by an oiled tarp. Mira pulled the covering aside, revealing supplies that should have rotted decades ago, preserved food, fresh water, warm blankets. And sitting on top of the pile, another letter in Elena's careful handwriting. She's been taking care of us, Mira said softly. Even from the depths, she's been making sure we'd have what we need for the journey. Whitaker picked up the letter. This one bore no date, just 2 words written in Elena's flowing script, "Welcome home." The mountain trembled again, more violently this time, and from somewhere far below came a sound like singing, if voices the size of avalanches could carry a tune. The Ancient One was waking, and it knew they were coming. The deeper they traveled, the more the tunnel system revealed its true nature. What had begun as a simple mining shaft branched into a labyrinth of passages that predated human presence by millennia. Natural caverns connected by channels carved from living rock. Their walls bearing symbols that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift when caught in peripheral vision. The miners thought they were following a vein of silver, Mira said, running her fingers along one of the symbol clusters. They had no idea they were tracing the boundaries of a prison. Whitaker studied the markings, his surveyor's training warring with instincts that screamed at him to look away. These weren't made by any tools I recognize. Grandmother's people say they were carved by the first guardians, long before recorded history. Each symbol is a warning and a ward, telling the story of what lies beneath and how to keep it contained. She moved to a side passage, one that angled sharply downward. This way. We need to reach the old mining camp before a sound cut her off, the whisper of wind through stone, but carrying voices. Not words in any language Whitaker recognized, but the cadence was unmistakably human. Men calling to each other in the darkness, their voices bright with hope and discovery. The miners, Mira whispered. Some part of them is still here, still working. Still believing they're going to strike it rich. The ghostly voices faded, replaced by the rhythmic clank of pickaxes against stone. But when Whitaker held up his lantern, the tunnel ahead remained empty. Only shadows danced on the ice-covered walls. They pressed on, following Mira's lead through passages that defied the mountain's known geology. Twice they passed side chambers where bones lay scattered, not human remains, but something larger, older. Ribs the size of wagon wheels, skull fragments that suggested creatures out of nightmare. The Ancient One wasn't the first thing to find refuge in these depths, Mira explained when she noticed his stare. The mountain has always been a haven for things that don't belong in the daylight world. Most of them were content to sleep, most of them. The mining camp, when they finally reached it, was a testament to human determination and folly. Canvas tents had been replaced by crude stone shelters built into the cavern walls. Tools lay scattered, as if their owners had simply vanished mid-swing. But everything was preserved in the strange, timeless cold of the deep places. Even the coffee still sitting in tin cups looked fresh enough to drink. They kept working, Whitaker marveled, examining a partially completed shaft that disappeared into the cavern floor. Even after the collapse, they kept digging. Eleanor told them to, Mira said, kneeling beside a fire pit that had been carefully arranged but never lit. The ones who survived the initial cave-in, she convinced them to keep excavating, told them they were working to contain the danger, not release it. From her pack, she withdrew something that made Whitaker's heart clench, a bone whistle, carved with intricate patterns and worn smooth by countless hands. It was no bigger than his palm, but when she held it up, the entire cavern seemed to hold its breath. "This belonged to my great-grandmother," she said, "passed down through the women of our line since before the white men came to these mountains. Elena's grandmother gave it to her, and Elena left it for me to find." She brought the whistle to her lips and blew a single haunting note. The sound echoed through the chamber, multiplying and harmonizing with itself until the walls rang like cathedral bells. And in that crystalline music, Whitaker heard something impossible, Elena's voice calling his name from the depths below. "Thomas," the echo seemed to whisper. "Thomas, I've been waiting." Tears froze on his cheeks before they could fall. "How is this possible?" "The mountain remembers everything," Mira said, tucking the whistle carefully away. "Every voice that's ever spoken in these depths, every soul that's ever descended seeking treasure or truth. Elena learned to use that memory to send messages through stone and ice. The haunting melody faded, but its effects lingered. The air felt warmer, as if Elena's presence had temporarily banished the killing cold. And with that warmth came new sounds, the drip of melting ice, the creak of settling timber, and underneath it all, a rhythm like a massive heartbeat. "She's holding it back," Mira said, interpreting the sounds with ears trained by generations of mountain wisdom. "But the effort is enormous. Every year it gets harder. Every season, the Ancient One grows stronger." Whitaker moved to examine the abandoned mining equipment, his hands running over familiar tools with the reverence of a man greeting old friends. Picks and shovels, survey chains and spirit levels, the instruments of his former profession. Abandoned when their wielders learned they were excavating their own doom. But it was what he found, beside the deepest shaft, that truly shook him. His own surveying transit. The brass instrument he'd used to map these peaks 40 years ago. It sat on its tripod, exactly as he'd left it, aimed into the darkness below, as if still taking measurements of the impossible. "Elena saved it for you," Mira said, joining him beside the familiar device. "She knew you'd need it for what comes next." Whitaker peered through the scope, adjusting the focus with hands that remembered the motions despite 4 decades of disuse. The instrument was still functional, its lenses clear and its mechanisms smooth. But what he saw through the eyepiece made no sense. Angles that violated basic geometry. Distances that seemed to shift even as he watched. The deep places don't follow the same rules as the surface world, Mira explained. Space bends around the Ancient One's prison. Elena learned to navigate by instinct rather than instruments. A new sound echoed from the shaft, not the ghostly miners or Elena's whispered messages, but something vast and patient stirring in the ultimate depths. The mountain trembled in response, and ice began to rain from the cavern ceiling. "It knows we're here," Mira said, shouldering her pack with practiced efficiency. "We need to move. The real descent starts now." Whitaker took one last look through his old transit, memorizing the impossible readings it displayed. Then he collapsed the tripod and slung the instrument across his back. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the tools of his trade and the memory of a love that had endured 40 years of separation. "Lead on," he said, following Mira toward the shaft that would carry them into the heart of the mountain's ancient secret. Behind them, the bone whistle's echo still rang faintly in the stone, carrying messages between the world of the living and whatever Elena had become in the depths below. The rope ladder descended into absolute darkness, its rungs slick with ice that had formed over decades of Elena's tears. Whitaker's hands, stiff with age and cold, gripped each wooden slat with the desperation of a man who knew that falling meant more than death. It meant joining the Ancient One's collection of half-living servants. 60 feet. Mira called up from below, her voice eerily amplified by the shaft's perfect acoustics. "There's a ledge here, solid footing." The ledge opened onto a chamber that defied everything Whitaker thought he knew about the mountain's structure. The walls were smooth as glass, curved in impossible spirals that seemed to fold back on themselves. But it wasn't the architecture that stopped his heart. It was the familiar equipment arranged in the chamber's center, his old surveying camp, preserved exactly as he'd left it on that final morning 40 years ago. The canvas chair where he'd sit to make calculations, the wooden table where Eleanor would spread her maps and make her mysterious notations. Even the tin cup he'd drunk coffee from, still sitting beside a cold fire pit as if waiting for his return. "She kept it all," he whispered, running his fingers over instruments that should have rusted to nothing in the mountain's dampness. "Everything that mattered to her," Mira agreed, lighting a fresh torch from her supply. "Everything that connected her to you, but it was the brass transit that drew his attention most powerfully. Not the one from the mining camp above, but his original instrument, the one he'd used to map these peaks with Elena at his side. It sat precisely where he'd placed it that last morning, aimed not at the tunnel mouth but at something deeper, more significant." Whitaker knelt beside the device, his hands moving automatically to adjust the focus. Through the scope he saw what Elena had been trying to show him in those final weeks. Angles that bent reality, sight lines that curved through dimensions no earthly surveyor should comprehend. She was mapping the prison, he breathed. "The real map," Mira said, spreading Elena's original charts on the familiar table. "Not the mineral surveys you made for the territory, but the spiritual geography of this place. The boundaries between what is and what should never be." The charts were covered in Elena's careful handwriting, but the symbols were from her grandmother's tradition, sacred geometry that described how to contain forces beyond human understanding. Each line on the map corresponded to a weakness in the Ancient One's bonds, each notation a recipe for strengthening the barriers that held it trapped. Whitaker traced one of the symbols with his finger, feeling it grow warm at his touch. "You're saying she knew? From the beginning she knew what we'd find down here. Grandmother's people always knew something slept in the mountain," Mira replied. "The mining operation just gave it an excuse to wake up. Elena tried to warn everyone, but I wouldn't listen." The memory came back with crushing clarity now. Elena standing in this very chamber, tears streaming down her face as she begged him to stop the excavation. She'd shown him readings on the transit that made no sense, pointed to survey markers that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. He dismissed it all as feminine hysteria, the natural fear of a woman confronted with forces beyond her understanding. God help him. He'd actually patted her shoulder and told her not to worry her pretty head about things she couldn't comprehend. "The day before the collapse," he said, his voice hollow with shame. "She came to me with all of this, showed me the real maps, tried to explain what the symbols meant. I told her she was being superstitious, and she smiled," Mira said gently, "kissed your forehead, and told you she understood why you couldn't see what she saw. Then she went to prepare for the sacrifice that would save everyone." The brass transit suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Through its lens, he could see Elena's final survey, not of mineral deposits, but of the Ancient One's prison, calculating exactly where to place the charges that would bring down the mountain and seal the creature in eternal darkness. "She used my own instruments against me," he realized. "Turned my maps into her weapons." "She used your love to give her strength," Mira corrected. "Every measurement, every calculation, every careful line you drew together, it all became part of the binding that's held the Ancient One for 40 years. A sound echoed from the depths below, like singing filtered through miles of stone. Not the ghostly miners this time, but Elena herself, her voice carrying through the mountain's bones to reach the chamber where their love had first taken root. The song had no words, but Whitaker understood its meaning anyway. "Welcome home. I've missed you. Come to me, beloved, and let us finish what we started." "She's calling," Mira said unnecessarily. "How much deeper?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be more than distance could measure. 3 more levels. The first is where the miners broke through to the natural caverns. The second is where Elena made her stand against the creature's first attempt to escape. The third, she paused, touching the bone whistle at her throat. The third is where she's been waiting for you. Another tremor shook the mountain, stronger this time. Dust rained from the impossible ceiling, and somewhere far above, they heard the sound of falling stone as passages collapsed. "It's fighting back," Whitaker observed. "It knows you're here, knows what Elena intends." Mira began gathering her equipment, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd made this journey before. The Ancient One has been patient for 40 years, but patience has limits. The closer we get to Elena, the harder it will try to stop us. As if summoned by her words, new sounds arose from the depths. Not Elena's singing or the miners' ghostly labor, but something altogether more disturbing. Voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech, calling out promises of power and threats of annihilation. The Ancient One was fully awake now, and it was afraid. "Good," Whitaker said, shouldering his old surveying equipment. "Fear means it knows it can lose," Mira smiled. And for a moment she looked exactly like Elena had on their wedding day, fierce and beautiful, and absolutely unafraid of whatever darkness lay ahead. "Let's go bring your wife home," she said, and led him toward the passage that would take them deeper into the heart of the mountain's most terrible secret. Behind them, the impossible chamber faded into shadow. But Elena's presence lingered in every carefully preserved artifact, every lovingly maintained instrument. 40 years of separation were almost over. For better or worse, the reunion was at hand. The passage beyond Elena's preserved chamber sloped sharply downward, carved not by human hands, but by forces that had shaped the earth before man learned to use tools. The walls here pulsed with a faint phosphorescence, as if the stone itself had absorbed decades of Elena's presence and now glowed with borrowed life. "Watch your step," Mira warned, pointing to where the floor seemed solid, but her torch revealed it to be a thin crust over a yawning chasm. The Ancient One's prison warps space around itself. What looks like safe ground might be nothing but shadow and hope. Whitaker tested each foothold with his walking stick before committing his weight, his surveyor's instincts screaming warnings that his instruments couldn't quantify. The compass on his belt spun wildly, unable to find true north in a place where magnetic fields bent around forces older than magnetism itself. They walked for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time moved strangely in the deep places, stretching and compressing according to rules that had nothing to do with the sun's passage overhead. The phosphorescent walls began to show veins of something that wasn't quite crystal, wasn't quite metal, but pulsed with its own inner light. Elena's research, Mira said when she noticed his fascination with the strange formations. She spent weeks studying these growths, trying to understand how they channel the mountain's power. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of their torchlight. But it was the sight at the chamber's heart that made Whitaker stumble and nearly fall. A laboratory that belonged in a university, not buried beneath a Montana mountain. Tables covered with careful notes and precise sketches. Instruments that combined scientific precision with designs that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere, samples of the strange crystalline formations, each one labeled in Elena's meticulous handwriting with observations that read like reports from an alien world. She never stopped learning, he whispered, approaching a desk where Elena's final research lay spread like an offering. Never stopped trying to understand. The notes were written in 3 languages: English, the formal scientific terminology of the 1880s, and the flowing script of Elena's grandmother's people. Cross-references and calculations covered page after page, documenting 40 years of patient study into forces that conventional science insisted couldn't exist. Day 14th 247 read one entry. The crystalline matrix continues to grow, following patterns that suggest conscious design rather than natural formation. The Ancient One's influence extends through these formations, but it also seems constrained by them. Perhaps the original Guardians understood something about symbiosis that modern thinking has forgotten. Another page, dated more recently. Thomas draws closer each day. I can feel his approach like sunrise after an endless night. The preparations are nearly complete. The transfer ritual requires precise timing, perfect synchronization between the old bonds and the new. Everything depends on love, proving stronger than fear. She's been documenting everything, Whitaker said, his voice thick with emotion. 40 years of research, all for this moment. She never gave up hope, Mira replied, examining a collection of crystal samples that pulsed in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. Even when the isolation should have driven her mad. Even when the Ancient One whispered promises of release in exchange for cooperation. She held fast to the belief that you'd come back for her. A new sound echoed through the chamber, not Elena's singing or the creature's threatening whispers, but something that made both of them freeze in recognition. Footsteps, measured, purposeful, moving through the laboratory with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Elena, Whitaker called, his voice cracking on the beloved name. The footsteps stopped. Then from behind a screen of hanging crystal formations, a figure emerged that was and wasn't the woman he'd loved. Elena's face, Elena's grace, but changed by 4 decades of exposure to forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. She looked exactly as she had on their last morning together, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no human should survive. Her skin had a translucent quality, as if she were made as much of light as flesh. And when she moved, the crystal formations around the laboratory chimed in harmony, recognizing their guardian's presence. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered, warm honey over mountain stone, carrying the music of wind through high places. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way." He wanted to run to her, to sweep her into his arms and pretend the last 40 years had been nothing but a nightmare. But something in her manner held him back, a careful distance that spoke of changes deeper than appearance. "You're not," he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. "Not quite alive in the way you understand it," she agreed, moving to one of the work tables with fluid grace. "But not dead either." The mountain's power sustains me, keeps me anchored to this realm, long enough to complete my work." She touched one of the crystal formations, and it flared with brilliant light. "I've become something between what I was and what I need to be. Eleanor, I'm sorry. I should have listened. You listened to what your training told you was real," she interrupted gently. "I don't blame you for being a man of your time, Thomas. Your skepticism was part of what I loved about you, that careful, methodical way you had of understanding the world." Mira stepped forward, bowing her head in respect. "Great Aunt, the barriers are failing. The time has come." Elena nodded, her expression growing grave. "Sooner than I hoped, but not unexpected. The world above grows more chaotic each year, and chaos feeds the Ancient One's strength." She turned back to Whitaker, and for a moment the otherworldly distance faded, leaving only the woman who'd shared his bed and his dreams. "I need you to understand what I'm asking, beloved. The transfer isn't just about taking my place. It's about becoming something more than human." "I understand," he said, though he wasn't sure he did. "Do you?" Her eyes searched his face with the intensity he remembered from their early days together. "To hold the Ancient One requires sacrificing everything that makes you Thomas Whitaker. Your memories, your personality, your connection to the surface world, all of it becomes secondary to the binding. You'll exist, but not as you are now." The weight of her words settled on him like stone. He looked around the laboratory at 40 years of Elena's sacrifice, documented in careful notes and precise observations. Then he looked at Mira, carrying the burden of generations in her young eyes. "What's the alternative?" he asked. Elena's smile was sad and beautiful and final. "The world ends. Not quickly, not cleanly, but piece by piece, as the Ancient One breaks free and remakes everything according to its hunger." The choice, when stated so simply, wasn't really a choice at all. Elena led them deeper into the laboratory, past instruments that defied classification and charts that mapped impossible geometries. At the chamber's far end, embedded in the living rock like a precious stone, set in an otherworldly crown, lay a book. If something made of crystallized light and fossilized time could be called a book, "My final journal," Eleanor said, approaching the impossible artifact with reverence. "Written not with ink but with essence itself, preserved in the mountain's memory for you to find." The crystal book pulsed with its own inner radiance, and as Whitaker drew near, words appeared in its translucent depths, not Elena's usual careful script, but something that seemed to write itself directly onto his consciousness. The truth, "My beloved, is harder than either of us imagined when we first descended into these depths. The mining disaster, it wasn't just an accident I prevented. And the Ancient One isn't just some primordial creature that happened to be sleeping in the mountain's heart." Whitaker's hands trembled as more words formed, revealing secrets that recontextualized everything he thought he understood. "I caused the collapse deliberately, yes, but not to trap something that was already here. The Ancient One was never a prisoner in this mountain, Thomas. It was a guardian. And what it was guarding was something far worse, something that our mining operation was about to set free." The crystal book flared brighter, and suddenly Whitaker could see through Eleanor's eyes, experiencing the memory as if it were his own. The deepest mining shaft, darker than any earthly darkness. The sound of picks breaking through into something that wasn't rock, wasn't earth, but wasn't empty either. The moment when 37 miners realized they'd broken through not into a vein of silver, but into a space between spaces where things waited that had been banished from reality itself. "The void speakers," the crystal continued. "Entities that exist in the gaps between what is and what isn't. They were cast out before time began, sentenced to hunger in the spaces between moments. The Ancient One was placed here to ensure they stayed banished. When the miners broke the seal—" "My God," Whitaker whispered as the full horror became clear. "The Ancient One was trying to protect us." Elena nodded, her expression heavy with 40 years of carrying this terrible knowledge. "It tried to warn the miners, to turn them back before they could complete the breach. But men drunk on dreams of silver wouldn't listen to warnings that came in languages older than human speech. Mira stepped closer, her face pale in the crystal's light. Then why did you seal it away? If it was the Guardian, because I had to choose, Elena replied, her voice carrying the weight of an impossible decision. The Void Speakers were already beginning to seep through. In another few hours, they would have gained enough purchase in our reality to start consuming it from within. The Ancient One alone couldn't hold them back, not with the seal broken, not with the barrier compromised. The crystal book pulsed again, showing them the moment of Elena's choice. Standing in the deepest shaft, surrounded by miners who were already beginning to change as the Void Speakers touched their minds. The Ancient One writhing in agony as it tried to maintain a barrier that was crumbling with each passing second. I made a bargain, the words continued. The Ancient One would allow itself to be sealed away with the Void Speakers, accepting imprisonment to prevent their escape. In return, I would become the new Guardian, maintaining the combined prison through will and sacrifice and love strong enough to endure beyond death. But that means... Whitaker began, then stopped as the implications crashed over him. That means the creature you thought was our enemy has been suffering 40 years of imprisonment to keep the world safe, Elena finished. And every day the Void Speakers whisper to it, promising freedom if it will just stop fighting. Just let them slip through the cracks into reality. The laboratory around them seemed to shimmer. And suddenly, Whitaker could see the truth of the mountain's deeper architecture. Not a prison designed to contain evil, but a complex mechanism of sacrifice and symbiosis. The Ancient One's pain, feeding the barriers that held the Void Speakers at bay. Elena's love providing the strength to maintain the balance. And beneath it all, the patient, terrible hunger of things that existed in the spaces between existence itself. The barriers aren't just failing because of time, he realized. The Ancient One is dying, 40 years of willing imprisonment, and it's finally breaking under the strain. Yes, Elena said simply. And when it dies, the Void Speakers will have nothing left to hold them back. They'll pour into reality like water through a broken dam, and everything, every person, every memory, every possibility, will be consumed and forgotten. Mira's voice was barely a whisper. How long do we have? Elena touched the crystal book, and new words formed, not a message this time, but a countdown. Numbers that shifted and flowed, marking not time in hours or days, but in heartbeats, in the slowly fading rhythm of something vast and patient and ultimately mortal. Days, maybe weeks, Elena said. The Ancient One's strength is failing. The pain is becoming too much to bear. Then we save it, Whitaker said with sudden determination. Find a way to strengthen the barriers, to ease its suffering. There is only one way, Elena interrupted. The transfer ritual I told you about, it doesn't just pass guardianship from me to you. It requires a sacrifice from all 3 points of the triangle. My knowledge, your love, and... She looked at Mira with eyes full of sorrow. And the willing sacrifice of one who carries the old blood, who can speak to the Ancient One in its own language. The terrible math became clear. To save the world, they would have to become the prison themselves, Whitaker taking Elena's place as the human anchor, Mira offering her life force to strengthen the bonds, and Elena herself dissolving into the barrier to provide the final seal. No, Whitaker said. There has to be another way. 40 years I've searched for another way, Elena replied. Every book, every ritual, every scrap of knowledge the mountain contains. This is the only path that doesn't end with the Void Speakers devouring everything we've ever loved. A sound echoed from deeper in the mountain. Not the Ancient One's pain or the miners' ghosts, but something infinitely worse. Whispers in languages that hurt to hear, voices that spoke of endings and unmaking, the patient hunger of things that existed in the cracks between reality's foundation stones. The Void Speakers were stirring, sensing opportunity in the Ancient One's weakening resolve. Time was running out, and the hardest choice of all still lay ahead. "Show us," Whitaker said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his heart. "Show us how to perform the ritual." Elena smiled, sad and proud and infinitely loving. "Follow me, my beloved. It's time to save the world." The descent to the ritual chamber took them through passages that existed more in memory than physical space. Elena moved ahead with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths for 4 decades, her translucent form providing its own ethereal light. Behind her, Whitaker and Mira followed in a silence heavy with the weight of approaching sacrifice. "The tools are already prepared," Elena said as they walked, her voice echoing strangely in the impossible corridors. "I've spent years gathering what we'll need, consecrating each item with the proper rituals." The passage walls here were different from anything they'd seen before. Not stone or crystal, but something that looked like fossilized starlight, surfaces that reflected not their physical forms, but the essence of what they might become. Whitaker caught glimpses of himself transformed, his human features dissolving into something vast and patient and eternally watchful. "The binding silver," Eleanor continued, gesturing to bundles of wire-thin metal that seemed to generate its own cold. "Mined from the deepest veins, where the mountain's power runs strongest. Each strand has been blessed by 3 generations of my grandmother's people." Mira touched one of the silver strands and jerked her hand back with a gasp. "It's alive. Everything in the deep places carries some spark of consciousness," Elena explained. "The silver remembers its birth in the earth's heart, remembers the songs the first guardians sang to give it purpose. It will hold our intentions even when our own strength fails." They passed chambers filled with implements that belonged to no earthly tradition, bowls carved from meteoric stone, candles made from crystallized time, binding circles drawn in substances that existed only in the spaces between elements. Each item hummed with potential energy, waiting for the moment when human will would activate powers older than civilization. "The consecrated iron," Elena said, indicating spear points forged from metal that glowed with inner fire. "Not weapons in any conventional sense, but anchors for the ritual's focus. They'll pin the new bindings to reality's foundation, ensure the transfer doesn't simply dissipate into the void." Whitaker studied the iron points, his surveyor's eye automatically cataloguing their placement in relation to the chamber's geometry. "These positions, they correspond to your original maps. Every measurement we took together contributed to this moment," Elena confirmed. "Each survey stake, each calculation, each careful line we drew across the mountain's face became part of the greater pattern. Our love quite literally shaped the geography of salvation." The final item in Elena's collection made them all stop and stare. A bowl carved from what appeared to be crystallized sound, its surface rippling with harmonic frequencies that created visual patterns in the air above it. Inside the bowl, liquid that wasn't water caught the light and threw it back in colors that had no names. "The binding stones," Eleanor said reverently. "Not stones at all, but droplets of the original music, the sound the universe made when it first chose to exist rather than remain void. Mix them with blood willingly given, and they become a foundation strong enough to hold back entropy itself." As they walked, Elena began to teach them the words they would need, not English or any human language, but syllables that seemed to resonate directly with the bones. Phrases that carried meaning through vibration rather than definition. Whitaker's tongue struggled with sounds his throat wasn't designed to make, while Mira picked up the ancient cadences with the fluidity of inherited memory. "The ritual has 3 phases, Elena explained as they approached their destination. "First, the severance, breaking my connection to the current bindings without allowing the ancient one to escape. Second, the transference, anchoring Whitaker's essence to the Guardian Matrix, while Mira provides the life force to power the transition. Third, the sealing, my dissolution into the barrier itself, creating a lock that can only be opened by love stronger than the fear of ending. The mathematics of sacrifice laid bare, clinical and inescapable. Whitaker felt the weight of Elena's 40 years pressing down on him, decades of isolation, of holding back forces that could unmake reality, of choosing duty over every human desire for connection and peace. "Will I remember?" he asked quietly. Elena's expression grew infinitely tender. Fragments, echoes, the shape of love if not its specific contours. Enough to sustain purpose across the centuries, but not enough to drive you mad with longing for what you've lost. They emerged into the ritual chamber, and Whitaker's breath caught in his throat. The space was vast beyond measurement, its boundaries lost in shadows that seemed to extend into other dimensions entirely. At its center stood a structure that was part altar, part machine, part living organism, a complex arrangement of silver wire and iron anchors and crystalline formations that pulsed with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. And around it all, barely visible in the chamber's strange light, lay the Ancient One. It was beautiful and terrible beyond description, not the monster Whitaker had imagined, but something that might have been divine if divinity could suffer. Its form shifted between states, sometimes appearing as a creature of living starlight, sometimes as geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But in every manifestation, the same quality shone through, exhaustion so profound it had become a physical force. 40 years, Elena whispered, approaching the suffering guardian with infinite compassion. 40 years of holding the void at bay, of choosing the pain of imprisonment over the easy release of surrender. The Ancient One's attention turned to them, and Whitaker felt its awareness like pressure against his mind. Not malevolent, he understood that now, but alien beyond any hope of true communication. Yet in its alien thoughts he sensed recognition, even gratitude. It knew why they had come. The Void Speakers test the barriers every moment, Elena continued, moving to begin the ritual preparations. Sometimes they send whispers of false hope, promising the Ancient One freedom if it will just stop fighting. Sometimes they offer threats, visions of what they'll do to reality if released. But mostly they simply wait. They know that even the strongest will can eventually break under enough pressure. Around the chamber's perimeter, Whitaker could see evidence of that patient assault, cracks in reality itself where the Void Speakers pressed against the boundaries of existence. Through those hairline fractures, he caught glimpses of unspaces where things that had never been born writhed in eternal hunger. The ritual must be performed in sequence, Elena said, her hands moving with practiced precision to arrange the sacred implements. Any deviation, any hesitation, and the barriers will collapse before the new bindings can take hold. "Are you both ready?" Mira nodded, her young face set with determination that belonged to generations of guardian bloodlines. "I've been ready since grandmother first told me the stories." Whitaker looked around the impossible chamber. At the suffering Ancient One, at the woman he'd loved for 40 years, finally within reach. At the young woman whose sacrifice would make salvation possible. The weight of the world's survival pressed down on him, but beneath it, he felt something else, a strange peace that came from finally understanding his purpose. "I'm ready," he said. Elena smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had on their wedding day, young and hopeful and absolutely certain that love could overcome any obstacle. "Then let us begin," she said, taking her place at the ritual circle's heart. "Let us save everything that matters." Outside the chamber, beyond the mountain's protective bulk, the world continued its daily routines, unaware that its continued existence hung in the balance. But in the deep places where reality wore thin, ancient forces stirred with anticipation. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The ritual that would determine the fate of everything began with a single word spoken in a language older than human speech, a word that meant both ending and beginning, both sacrifice and redemption. Elena spoke it clearly, and the mountain itself held its breath. Elena's word of beginning rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, each syllable creating waves of power that made the air itself shimmer. The Ancient One responded immediately, its massive form shifting as it recognized the start of the ritual that would either save or damn everything it had suffered to protect. The silver threads began to glow, lifting themselves from their careful arrangements to weave patterns in the air above the altar. Each strand carried decades of Elena's intentions, 40 years of hope and determination made manifest in precious metal that remembered its purpose. As they moved, they sang, harmonies that existed below the range of human hearing, but that resonated in the bones nonetheless. Severance, Elena intoned, placing her hands on the crystalline bowl. The liquid inside began to bubble and spark, responding to her touch with displays of impossible color. I release my claim to the Guardian Bond. I surrender my hold on the Ancient One's willing captivity. Let the chains of sacrifice be broken, but let the prisoner remain true to its oath. The chamber shuddered as Elena's connection to the binding matrix began to dissolve. For 40 years, her will had been woven into the very fabric of the Ancient One's prison, her love providing the strength to maintain barriers that should have crumbled decades ago. Now, as those connections severed one by one, cracks appeared in the walls of reality itself. Through the fractures, Whitaker caught glimpses of the Void Speakers, shapes that existed in the spaces between existence, hungers that fed on the possibility of things rather than the things themselves. They pressed against the weakening barriers with increasing desperation, sensing their chance at freedom growing stronger with each severed thread. The transference begins, Elena called, her voice already growing distant as her connection to physical form weakened. Thomas, step forward and accept the burden I have carried. Whitaker moved to the altar's center, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a mantle made of starlight and shadow. The moment his feet touched the sacred circle, every cell in his body began to change, transforming from merely human to something capable of holding forces that could reshape reality. I accept, he said. The words carrying power he didn't understand, but could feel reshaping him from within. I take up the Guardian's burden. I bind myself to the Ancient One's oath. The silver threads descended toward him, each one seeking a point of connection, heart, mind, soul, where human will could anchor itself to obligations older than humanity. As they touched him, Whitaker felt Elena's memories flooding into his consciousness. 40 years of vigilance, of loneliness, of choosing duty over every natural human desire for connection and peace. But beneath the weight of those memories, he also felt something else, the Ancient One's gratitude. The massive entity had never wanted to be a jailer, had accepted its role as guardian only because the alternative was universal annihilation. Now, with the ritual proceeding, it began to hope that its long imprisonment might finally serve its intended purpose. "Mira," Elena called, her form beginning to fade as the severance neared completion.
The life force.
The ritual requires your willing sacrifice to power the new bindings. The young woman stepped forward without hesitation, drawing the bone whistle from around her neck. As she brought it to her lips, the chamber filled with music that belonged to no earthly tradition. Songs her grandmother's people had sung to honor the mountain's power. Melodies that carried the accumulated wisdom of generations who had guarded the deep places. "I give my life force freely," Mira said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I offer my essence to strengthen the bonds that hold back chaos. Let my sacrifice serve the greater good." The whistle's song grew louder, more complex, drawing harmonies from the silver threads and the crystalline formations until the entire chamber rang like a vast musical instrument. As the music reached its crescendo, light began to flow from Mira's body. Not the harsh glare of electricity, but the warm radiance of a life lived with purpose. That light flowed toward Whitaker, merging with the silver threads to create connections that transcended physical law. He felt Mira's strength becoming his strength, her courage reinforcing his determination, her grandmother's ancient knowledge filling gaps in his understanding. The Ancient One stirred, its massive form rippling as it felt the new guardian taking shape. For the first time in 40 years, its burden was being shared by willing hands, its lonely vigil supported by love, freely given rather than duty grimly accepted. But the Void Speakers weren't passive observers. As the ritual reached its critical phase, they launched their final assault on the weakening barriers. Reality cracked like glass under impossible pressure, and through those cracks poured whispers of unmaking. Promises of the sweet release that came with choosing non-existence over the pain of being. "Hold fast," Elena commanded, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere as she began the final phase of her dissolution. "The sealing comes next. Everything depends on love proving stronger than fear." The chamber exploded into light as three forms of sacrifice merged into something greater than the sum of their parts. A prison made of willing hearts, strong enough to hold back the end of everything. The sealing began with Elena's laughter, not the bitter sound of someone facing death, but the joyous recognition of a task finally completed. Her form, already translucent from the severance, began to dissolve into streams of pure intention that flowed toward the cracks in reality, where the Void Speakers pressed their assault. 40 years I've waited for this moment," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself as she became part of the chamber's eternal song. 40 years of holding the line alone. Now we've finished what we started, beloved. Now we save everything that matters." The crystalline formations around the altar began to resonate, each one adding its voice to a symphony that existed in dimensions beyond sound. Whitaker felt the music in his bones, in his blood, in the newly transformed essence that connected him to the Ancient One's patient suffering. Through that connection, he experienced the full scope of what they were fighting to preserve, not just human civilization, but the possibility of existence itself. The Void Speakers' assault intensified, reality buckling under their desperate hunger. Through the widening cracks, Whitaker glimpsed their true nature, not creatures in any sense he could comprehend, but absences given form, hungers that existed in the spaces between thoughts. They had been waiting since before time began for any opportunity to enter reality and consume it from within. "I can't hold them," he gasped, feeling his newly acquired guardian powers straining against forces that predated creation itself. "You don't have to hold them alone," Mira replied, her life force continuing to flow into the binding matrix. "We are 3 points of a triangle, 3 aspects of the same purpose. Elena's knowledge, your love, my blood. Together we are stronger than the sum of our parts." The Ancient One stirred, adding its own desperate strength to their combined effort. For 40 years, it had borne this burden in willing isolation, accepting imprisonment to prevent universal catastrophe. Now, with human hearts sharing its load, it found reserves of power it had thought exhausted decades ago. Elena's dissolution accelerated, her essence flowing into the hairline fractures where reality wore thin. Where her love-charged energy touched the cracks, they began to seal not with crude patches, but with structures more beautiful and resilient than the original barriers had ever been. "The old guardians built their prison from duty and fear," she explained as her form became increasingly insubstantial. "Our binding is built from choice freely made, from love that chooses sacrifice over safety. It will hold longer and stronger because it springs from the best of what humanity can be." But the Void Speakers weren't finished. Sensing their window of opportunity closing, they poured everything they had into one final assault. The chamber shook as competing forces, preservation and annihilation, met in direct conflict. For a moment that lasted either an instant or an eternity, the outcome hung in perfect balance. Then Whitaker understood what was required. The ritual needed more than Elena's knowledge, more than Mira's life force, more than the Ancient One's resigned endurance. It needed him to make the same choice Eleanor had made 40 years ago, to become something more than human in service of humanity's survival. "I see it now," he said, releasing his hold on everything that made him Thomas Whitaker. His memories, his personality, his human attachments, all of it flowed into the binding matrix, adding the weight of a life fully lived to the forces holding back chaos. The transformation was agonizing and ecstatic simultaneously. As his individual identity dissolved, Whitaker felt himself becoming part of something vast and eternal. Not just a guardian of the Ancient One's prison, but a fundamental force in reality's ongoing choice to exist rather than surrender to void. Elena's laughter echoed through dimensions as their essences merged. 40 years of separation ending in a union deeper than any physical embrace. Together, they became the lock that would hold until love itself ceased to have meaning. Mira's whistle sang its final note, her life force completing the circuit that connected all 3 points of the Guardian Triangle. As her body collapsed, empty of everything that had made her unique, her sacrifice became the foundation upon which the new prison would stand for ages yet to come. The Void Speaker's assault faltered, then failed completely. The cracks in reality sealed themselves with structures of living light, barriers that would grow stronger rather than weaker with the passage of time. The Ancient One's long torment was finally shared, its burden made bearable by willing partners who had chosen duty over desire. In the moment of victory, the chamber filled with peace so profound it seemed to extend beyond the mountain, beyond the earth, into the very fabric of space and time. The binding was complete. The world was safe. The price had been paid in full. Where 3 individuals had stood moments before, only one remained, a figure that was part Whitaker, part Elena, part Mira, and part something entirely new. The new guardian of an ancient trust, protector of a reality that would never know how close it had come to ending. The Ancient One settled into rest at last, its suffering shared, its purpose renewed. Around them both, the mountain sang with contentment, its long vigil finally bearing fruit. The mountain slept peacefully for the first time in 40 years. Dawn broke over the peaks of Montana with unusual clarity, the air itself seeming cleaner, more substantial, as if the very atoms had been relieved of some invisible burden. Animals emerged from shelters they hadn't realized they'd been seeking. Birds sang with voices that carried farther than they should, and the wind through the pines spoke of deep contentments finally achieved. In the abandoned town of Copper Falls, snow began to melt despite the season's cold. The skeletal buildings seemed less threatening now, their broken windows reflecting morning light instead of shadows. Nature was already beginning the slow work of reclamation, green shoots pushing through gaps in rotted floorboards, as if the earth itself recognized that this place was finally safe to inhabit, deep beneath the mountain, in chambers that existed between dimensions. The new guardian began the first entry in a journal that would span centuries. The writing appeared not on paper, but directly in the crystalline formations that lined the walls, a permanent record for those who might one day follow. Day 1 of the new binding. The words formed themselves in script that combined Whitaker's careful precision, Elena's flowing grace, and Mira's bold confidence. The transference is complete. The Ancient One rests peacefully, its burden shared at last. The void. Speakers have withdrawn to whatever spaces exist beyond the edges of existence, their assault finally and definitively repelled. I am no longer Thomas Whitaker, yet I remember his love. I'm no longer Elena Redhawk, yet I carry her wisdom. I'm no longer Mira Blackfoot, yet her courage flows through every decision I make. We are something new, a guardian born from willing sacrifice, stronger than any individual could be alone. The writing paused as the consciousness that had once been 3 separate souls turned its attention to the great work ahead. The mountain's power flowed through crystalline networks that extended far beyond these peaks, connecting to other places where reality wore thin, other sites where ancient vigilance was required. The world holds more secrets than we suspected. Other mountains, other guardians, other ancient things that chose duty over freedom. We are not alone in this vigil. The network of watchers spans continents, an invisible web of protection that keeps humanity's nightmares at bay. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning. The old isolation is broken. The terrible loneliness that drove Elena to desperation and the Ancient One to the edge of surrender, that is finished. We guard together now, all of us connected by bonds stronger than steel, united in purpose, across any distance, miles away, in a small town whose people would never know how close they'd come to ceasing to exist. An old woman woke from dreams, filled with her granddaughter's laughter. She didn't remember the specifics, but she carried the certainty that Mira's sacrifice had not been in vain, that the young woman's courage had purchased something precious beyond price. The woman rose, dressed, and walked to her kitchen window overlooking the mountains. For just a moment in the early morning light, she could swear she saw 3 figures standing on the highest peak, an old man, a young woman in traditional dress, and another woman whose hair caught sunlight like spun gold. They raised their hands in greeting, in farewell, in blessing. Before fading into the mountain mist, she smiled, understanding without knowing why, and began to prepare breakfast for the first morning of a safer world. The binding holds strong, the Guardian's journal continued, stronger than the old prison ever was, because it was built from love rather than mere duty. The Ancient One speaks to me now in harmonies that span octaves of meaning. It tells me of the long ages it watched alone, of the relief that comes with finally sharing the burden, of gratitude for companions who chose this path willingly. Elena's research continues through me. Every day reveals new insights into the forces we guard against, new ways to strengthen the barriers, new hope that future generations might find less costly solutions to eternal problems. Her laboratory remains active, instruments measuring realities that conventional science cannot detect, documenting the slow healing of spaces where the void speakers left their mark. Whitaker's maps prove invaluable in this expanded role. The careful surveys he made in life become guides for navigating dimensions beyond physical space. His methodical nature, his refusal to accept easy answers, his need to understand the mechanisms behind apparent miracles, all of these qualities serve the guardianship well. Mira's blood carries the memory of all her grandmother's teachings, connections to other guardian lineages that stretch back to humanity's dawn. Through her sacrifice, I maintain contact with watchers in every corner of the world, each one protecting sites where ancient powers once threatened to break free. The crystal formations pulsed with gentle light as the journal entry neared its close, each word carved permanently into the mountain's memory for those who might one day need this knowledge. The world turns in its seasons, unaware that its continued existence rests in the hands of those who chose to become something more than human. This is as it should be. The best guardianship is invisible. The greatest victories are those that prevent disasters no one will ever know almost happened. We are content. We are purposeful. We are complete. The watch continues. The binding holds. All is well. Above, in the world of sunlight and seasons, spring finally came to Montana. Snow melted, flowers bloomed, and life continued its ancient rhythm of growth and renewal. Children played in valleys that had almost been consumed by forces older than stars. Lovers made promises in meadows where reality itself had nearly unraveled. And dreamers looked up at mountain peaks and felt, without knowing why, that they lived in a world worth believing in. The Guardian's work was done for now. The vigil would continue as long as love proved stronger than fear, as long as some souls were willing to choose duty over desire, as long as the light remained worth defending against the dark. In the deep places, 3 who had become one smiled with shared contentment and settled in to watch over the world they had chosen to save.